Gotta admit that I'm feeling a little bit silly with this huge microphone plugged into my phone, but this is the best possible audio that I could get with this setup. So, and since I make a lot of sacrifices for this channel, I'm gonna make this one as well. And I'm gonna be talking about someone who likewise purports to make sacrifices, but really doesn't, right? And this personality is Dr. Phil. I recently came across a podcast that he did with Joe Rogan, and I mean, just sort of like immediately like sitting down to watch it, right? I had very uncomfortable vibrations, let's call them. The reason for that is, first of all, you know, I am familiar with Dr. Phil's past, right? First of all, he was sort of put into the public sphere in the 90s by Oprah, right? She decided to put him on. She herself, right, is a very problematic personality, right, to use that well-loved phrase. Problematic because she has mainstreamed a lot of behavior that should have never been mainstreamed, right? Stuff that we ought to all socially stigmatize very heavily. Like, for instance, that time that she confronted her mother with a video camera and a crew at her house, just suddenly, right, without her expecting it, it seems, to discuss what I think it was like a half sister or whatever that she never knew about, basically asking her mother, why didn't you tell me what, you know? And you could tell that her mother just wished that she could have this conversation alone, right, instead of having everything aired out for whatever reason on TV. And Dr. Phil, right, he does a similar kind of thing, right? Most recently, one of his like biggest controversies was like back in 2016 when he had this interview with Shelley Duvall, right? She was the actress in Kubrick's The Shining, and she's clearly someone that's going through a lot of mental problems, right? She's someone that might very well be like hallucinating or, you know, like real extreme stuff. There was no reason to have this kind of interview, right? You're just sort of putting everything out there as a, you know, as a circus, right? There's a lot of circus antics going on from all directions. Whether it's Kanye West, right, who's a kind of like circus freak for white people to make fun of, circus freak for a certain kind of black person, right, to either poke fun of or, anyway. So these are the kinds of antics that Dr. Phil has been responsible for, right? I remember just sort of kind of like laughing at the show and watching it when I was a kid. Right, but I never took it too seriously, and I was just kind of amazed at seeing how many adults there were in the audience and how many adults there still are that kind of listen to him. And the podcast, therefore, more or less went in the same direction. So, first of all, he begins with this idea that kind of controls everything else that he was going to say, right, throughout the rest of this podcast, right? He begins with a controlling idea. And even if he tries to sort of get away from it in different sort of subtle ways as things go on, he starts with this idea of the world as a meritocracy. And I understand why people might say that, right? It's because they're using language very imprecisely. It's because they're not willing to sort of sit down and understand, you know, the various meanings of words and maybe try to find better words to express what they in fact mean. On another level, right, they might be consciously or unconsciously just pushing forward a kind of narrative, right? This thing where you, at the one hand, you're sort of making a technical observation about the world, and there's an implicit sort of value judgment, right? There's an implicit sort of a normative comment that comes out of it, but you hide the normative comment and you pretend that it's not there, right? And Dr. Phil was doing that a lot. So by calling the world a meritocracy, this is the problem with that kind of statement. It's only a meritocracy in the sense that we have a ton of rails in the world, right? And they all lead you to a certain number of outcomes. And they all lead you, again and again, very much the same outcomes. And, you know, we could list some of them off, right? Someone might say that a voting system, right, democracy, that's a meritocracy. in a technical sense, I guess it is, right? If you have in America sufficient votes, right, for president or whatever, you're going to, according to that system, right, you're going to become president, you're going to become senator, whatever. But I don't think any one of us, right, especially Americans, if you're watching this, I don't think most Americans would agree that it's a meritocracy in a deeper way, right? I mean, like if you look at the 2016 election, the idea that either Trump or Hillary was going to win, and that would show sort of like the most meritorious person, you know, in America to run, or even like period, right? A lot of people would say like this was the best person, period. We know that's bullshit, right? And that to be the case, whether or not you fold one way politically or another, right? Because you could always entertain some sort of counterfactual, right? If Hillary Clinton, half the people watching this, that would be horrible, right? Trump had won, and many people watching this hated that as well, right? But I think those among us that don't really fall into one of the two parties, we will all agree that there's not actually any, obvious merits to one winning over the other, right? It's only in a highly technical sense of this is the tools that we're given, this is how the world works, right? But it's not that these people were somehow innately deserving of what they ultimately got, which is either one or the other totally controlling what happens, right? The fate of the United States of America, right? That's I think many people would at least agree with that. And of course, the same is applicable in almost any other way, right? And you can sort of run down the things that are occurring in the world that we will all agree that this is clearly not an issue of merit, right? For those among us that are really into the arts, right, into books, looking at the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years of publishing, clearly it's not the meritorious work that becomes popular. It is simply what is most popular that becomes popular, right? What can sort of like tap into, it could be like a zeitgeist, it could be just kind of like a fad, whatever it's going to be, right? And again, you could in a highly technical sense make the argument that, well, all that we're really talking about here is, being aware of these rails on them, right? Jumping at that train, jumping at that cart, and being transported as cargo wherever it goes, right? And that means it doesn't matter whether this train cart is taking you to a slaughterhouse where you're going to be chopped up. It doesn't matter whether it's taking you to hell. It doesn't matter whether it's taking you to heaven. You won't know either way, right? You're just jumping on a rail. And of course, there's a lot of propaganda around where everything's going, right? Where this cart is taking you, that rail is taking you there. But that seems to just be entrenched interest, right? That seems to me, we'll just say it's just stuff that people say, right, in order to get the maximum number of people on their particular carts, right? Politically, right, right? That's the one he made that I think was good, right? Dr. Phil said something like, both parties, all they talk about is go vote, you have to vote, do it, right? Because there's this kind of assumption there that in and of itself is an innate good, and it's not an innate good to discuss exactly what you're voting for, why you're voting, why should we, for you or for you, right? And that's another thing, right? He doesn't seem to really understand how even an observation like that he makes is sort of in contradiction to what he's saying about meritocracy, right? Everything is set up in a certain way that you could follow a pre-made path or not. And if you do follow a pre-made path, there are certain outcomes. Again, this is true, right? If you do well in school, if you go around and you do well in college, right? And you pick a major that is tied with, I don't know, some rapidly growing industry or job or whatever, you will do better, than someone that doesn't do those things, like all else being equal, right? On average, even if you, not you personally, again, imagine running that simulation 1,000 times. That's generally how things will fall. But again, nobody's sort of like discussing the underpinnings here, right? The underpinnings of what are these values that we're talking about, right? America seems to be so intent on proving the exact opposite of meritocracy, and yet meritocracy is still the discussion. Like I'm still kind of surprised that this is not challenged more, right? Whether, you know, like again, whether you were into Trump or not, right? That was sort of like a little bit challenged, right? There was this kind of like moment I remember, like in 2016, 2017, like the myth of American meritocracy is shattered, but that kind of went away. Now we're back to that same discussion, right? Especially, and that's the thing, a lot of the same people that were talking about meritocracy shattered, they probably believe that with the election of Biden, meritocracy has once. In fact, we saw a lot of these, right, at the end of 2020. So, just remember, right? Like, just simply using that phrase meritocracy, that does assume values, right? That does assume that whatever the sort of like status quo that ends up emerging, right? There's something meritorious there, which again, like given how much these two men were complaining about, like, you know, all the typical shit, right? Like they're saying they're not going to be very political and they're going to be nonpartisan, and yet all the complaints that they seem to have are the complaints that typically the right doles out, right? I don't want to use the word conservative because there's not any true conservatism in America, right? There's extreme radical right-wingers, and there's people that are center-right, and then there's like a smattering of, like, you know, whoever might be anywhere. But simply using the word meritocracy, it does imply a certain level of like a value judgment, right? And if they're out there sort of complaining and they're doing the typical complaints, right? Trans issues. They're complaining about why don't facts matter anymore, right? That kind of golden age thinking that facts used to really, 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 really matter. What, a century ago, facts mattered? 2 centuries ago, did facts matter then? You know, I would pose this question: when exactly did facts matter, and when did facts stop mattering? Right, because just with the way that everything is hardwired for power, right, for ascension, filling in these niches whenever you see a gap in the universe, right, something wants to rush to fill it. Facts are not going to be the things that rush to fill it, right? Even in terms of like human biology, right, in human evolution, it is true that generally speaking, right, we've evolved in a way that allows us to you know, understand the world in a way that allows us to survive. But in a more kind of complex world like the one we're living in now, that it's not just about mere pure survival in the ancestral environment, but like, I don't know, city life or whatever it might be. Things like a true underpinning reality, right? That's not useful anymore. It's not going to be selected for evolutionarily. And because it's not selected for, any like underpinning reality is actually different from what you see. It's different from the emotional biases that you end up investing into the world, right? It's different from the values that you might hold, and it's very important to be aware of that. It's very important to be aware that everything is essentially those cargo trains that I mentioned, right? And everybody, right? People are always like standing out with a placard telling you, get on this cart, get in this cart, get in this cart, get in this cart. They have so many promises about where it's going, but you never do make it to exactly where they say you're going to be, right? Because they're suffering under the same delusions that you are in that way. So that's the first part, right? So meritocracy is, it's a bullshit concept, right? Because we're not there yet. I think that's an ideal that we ought to work for, right? Like, again, on this channel, if you look at my discussion on the arts, I never say, you know, well, if only this person was had a better life, they would be a better artist. But they're horrible, so let me boost them anyway because, like, what if, right? I never want to cut any kind of slack, right? I want to sort of measure things in an absolute way, and I think that's fine. But when he starts with this assumption of meritocracy, it really colors the entire discussion of everything else, right? And another example would be when, so he moves from this idea of everything is a meritocracy in America to, I don't know, like if you guys watch that podcast, you remember how quickly he sort of moves, and the kind of seamless transition, I think, sort of should tell you everything, right? How quickly he moved from this idea of meritocracy down to this assumption, for instance, that like, oh, look, what are the problems of the world? One of them is this need for redistribution, right? Like, think about what that entails, right? If you're going to make that kind of statement, what that means is, A, things turn out more or less as they ought, right? If we're talking about a meritocracy, right? That's kind of like inherent in the definition, right? Things turn out more or less as they ought. Things turn out more or less according to human effort. Things more or less turn out, period. If you then start with that assumption, you're going to have to complain about concepts such as wealth redistribution. But both Rogan and Dr. Phil are discussing wealth redistribution as if it's coming from the opposite direction compared to where, in fact, it's coming from. Right? We had a ton of wealth redistribution in this country and really the world over, and it went in a very obvious direction. It went from the bottom to the top. That was the trajectory going like what? So maybe starting in, you could say in the 50s and 60s, right? When you would look at something like Social Security taxes started becoming more onerous in the sense that they were being paid for by the upper classes, and now more and more of the slack was being picked up by people of lower socioeconomic status. Other examples, right? Taxation, no matter who's in office, Democrat, Republican, either a Republican cuts taxes drastically for the rich, or a Democrat is in power who doesn't do anything about it, or has like a very, very minor adjustment that is like sort of made up for elsewhere. Like, Bill Clinton did a very, very mild, right, reversal of Reagan's policy, but that was made up for by increased subsidies to various businesses, right? So whatever slack that they were feeling, right, whatever sort of pain they might have been feeling, that was all reversed fairly quickly. And we're having the same thing now, right? Like Biden, he promised us a total reversal of Trump's tax cuts on day one. That was the promise. And, of course, like you had to know that was a big crowd of people. You had to know from the very start that was total bullshit, right? And sure enough, right, that's what happened right now. He's happening right now. The minimum tax globally. Not gonna, that's gonna be a drop in the bucket compared to what actually happened, in 2017. That is not getting reversed, right? And it's always been like that. So, isn't it kind of maddening, right, when you hear discussions of wealth redistribution, right, as this kind of like evil that is coming? It's coming, right? It's always in the horizon. And it's always in the horizon because what they mean is the danger is, right, from top to bottom, right? Going from the top down to the bottom, that is the true danger that we need to be aware of. So they therefore give no space, no discussion to bottom-up redistribution, which is the norm, right? Which ought to be the actual conversation that we're having. And that's kind of fascinating, right? So he goes from meritocracy, which assumes, again, inherently, it assumes things are turning out more or less as they ought. Even if you sort of allow a little bit of like space for mistakes or whatever, things more or less turn out as they ought, right? This is boosting the status quo. And then it's defending the status quo against these dangers of any sort of opposite direction. And you know, total contradiction to the later comments about let's examine the underpinning values behind this or that vote. What do we want? Then there's, you know, other examples, right? There's the more kind of generic hypocrisy that ends up coming out that is more that is back to like let's boost the status quo without quite saying it. If you guys recall in the podcast where they start sort of praising the takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk, they're like, well, Joe Rogan specifically was like, you know, Musk is just different, right? He has a different view of free speech. He's very different from other kinds of billionaires. And he, you know, he's probably going to do some good with free speech, was what the claim was. But this was couched also in a wider discussion of we need to be kinder, right? We need to be more understanding of one another. We can't just randomly insult and make fun of people, right? We need something more, right? We need to stamp out this kind of behavior. And Dr. Phil himself, right? He's like anti-bullying, right? He has this big shtick about don't be a bully, don't be a bully. Of course, like there's a lot of there's always been a ton of complaints about his work environment, the idea that he's always intimidating people that work for him, right? That he has like a set of people that he likes and doesn't like, right? People feel very much bullied by him. So as they're discussing all this, right? Be nice, be kind, don't insult, blah, 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 right? Free speech within the confines of that, right? They're also simultaneously laughing at Elon Musk, for instance, like tweeting out that image of Bill Gates, where Bill Gates has like a big pot belly and says something like, if you want to lose a boner fast, right? Here's this photo of Bill Gates. They're both laughing about it, right? I mean, not that I'm a big defender of Bill Gates, but it's just kind of fascinating how most people watching that, they're not going to pick up on that hypocrisy, right? They're not going to, and they themselves, right? They don't pick up on the hypocrisy. I'm sure that Joe Rogan thinks that he's making a great point, and that it's legitimate to do both of those things at the same time, no matter how contradictory. And then, of course, there's kind of like the smaller things. So, like beyond like the bigger sort of like political implications of what they're saying, and the sort of like, you know, quiet boosting the status quo without quite saying it, while also saying, you know, that you're looking for change and then doing everything that you can against it. They're also, they're now like, they were moving into lots of territory that was like kind of like generic Dr. Phil, let's call it just Dr. Phil exploitation, right? Obviously, everybody in the 90s and 2000s was doing that, right? That's what we were known for. Right? America was known for Jerry Springer. Russia, which tends to have this pretty big lag, right? Russia always likes to say that they are an alternative to the West. But the fascinating thing is just watching how much they just ape American culture, right? Like, you see like a lot of Jerry Springer type stuff. Soon after Jerry Springer comes to America. And Dr. Phil was one of them, you know, Oprah was one of them. And at some point, they started getting into a discussion of fentanyl. And I don't know why they went in this direction, but they started talking about Halloween. And at some point, Dr. Phil was like, you know, with this fentanyl epidemic and people not knowing what they're getting in terms of drugs or whatever, if I had kids that were trick-or-treating, you know, they come back with a bucket of candy, I'm going to throw all that candy out and I'm going to replace it with candy that I know the source of. Right, so that they don't die of an overdose. And I mean, look, Halloween came and went. I did not see any upticks in fentanyl overdoses. I did not see any stories about children overdosing from fentanyl. I did not see any reason to do such an extreme action of literally doubling the amount of candy that is bought and purchased because half of it gets thrown out. Right, I didn't see anything like that. And Dr. Phil, again, like, I don't know to what extent it's just kind of like second nature to him to just like engage in this kind of exploitative shit. And for Joe Rogan to not, you know, push back really against, you know, most of this kind of stuff. But he says something later like, and you know what? Like I remember like we're like,
and it used to be razor blades, right?
Razor blades and candy, and that did not force him to stop and think like, oh wait, is this just another, pointless moral panic? Is this actually what's going on? Are we just talking about yet another moral panic that's not going to go anywhere? Because, every society is taken to moral panics. It's very much human nature. But he didn't draw that connection, right? Or maybe he did. Maybe he did mentally draw that connection. He's not dumb in that sort of conventional sense, right? He is aware enough, right, of these kind of, let's call them meritocratic rails, right, in a highly technical sense of the phrase. And he knows very well that if I say this or if I say that, right, I could get attention, right? He says, let's not reward bad behavior. Let's not reward things that we want, that we don't want to see happening. And yet, it's just like attention-seeking behavior, right? It's back to, like on some level, right? He knows that he still has that core audience of white women, right? Like there's this kind of like odd sort of distinction, right? There's the white suburban women that were really into Oprah because watching Oprah made them feel maybe like more urban, more up to date with the world.
It's racist. They could be
totally white world. Their kids going to a totally white school, married to a white husband, but they still have this kind of a thing, right? Well, I watch Oprah, right? And I take her recommendations and I listen to her kind of like liberal antics when it comes to race. And on the other side, though, you have the Dr. Phil contingent, right? Which is kind of like the much more sanctimonious, much more like it's like sanctimony coupled with this, I don't know, this like feigned knowledge, right? And this feigned intelligence and this feigned like, I know it's always
going on with the psychological,
whatever, right? We're going to get to the bottom of this or that. So these are just the two separate contingents of the same kind of audience, right? It sort of like touches on different people in different ways, right? Touches on their kind of like maybe their personal sort of vanities and stories that they tell about themselves, their own personal tinker toys, right? In reference to the title of the novel that I'm working on, right? The stories that you tell yourself, the stories that the world tells to the rest of the world, the stories that are sort of put on the pedestal as, these are inarguable facts. And he still has that sort of contingent of like, suburban moms that are into Dr. Phil. So he's gonna do like a little moral panic, right? He can't do the razor blades anymore. And that reminds me of like when I was growing up in the 90s, when I was in, I was in Brooklyn. I was going to this Brooklyn elementary school, and I remember like kids in the 90s, like they were like fucking crying to like my teachers, like, oh, can you walk me home? It's Halloween, or
it could be like Friday the 13th.
I hear that the Bloods are out, and they're gonna, if they catch me, they're gonna cut my face. Right, which is like, this was not what was going on, right? This was and like there was nobody there to tell them otherwise, right? People like Dr. Phil, if he had a show then, he might have had like a special on Friday the 13th in urban centers, right? Crips and Bloods are out in full force and they're hunting young kids, right? And they're there. They're not there to take their candy. They're there to slice their faces apart with razors, right? Nobody was there to tell kids like, no, like, don't. I remember like my teacher, like, pushing back, like being like, no, like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it, little boy. Right. Just go, just go home. It'll be fine. And of course it was, and
I remember like the first
shit, like, is any of this real? And then like one Friday the 13th passed, another one. All right. One Halloween passed, another one. And you still heard the same stories, but it was like, this is bullshit. You guys are pushing this for, perfectly kind of like human reason, but it's not legitimate factually, right? So I mean, he's still always up to his old tricks. I will say that, you know, to give credit to him, maybe it's because he did work with homeless people in his life, in his personal life, but he did at some point start talking about homelessness, and he was like, you know what, like, don't be one of these people that demands that, oh, you see a homeless person, like, oh, they have to be in a shelter. Why aren't you in a shelter?
It's your fault, right? He says there's
Why people might not want to be in a shelter, right? There's many reasons.
it could be
You can't take in, right? There's a lot of violence there, like whatever it might be. And when he did talk about like the right now there is, you know, like I was always kind of like wary of like ever saying like, oh, there's like an education crisis or a teaching crisis. But after COVID, there is a teaching crisis, right? People that I know that have been teaching for a long time, they quit, right? They quit. They're like, this is too much. I can't deal with this shit. The New York City Department of Education cut something like, I forget exactly what the number was, but it was a huge cut, right, compared to what it used to be. And
the police was overfunded, right?
And, you know, like you don't do this at a time when kids are very far behind. And Dr. Phil said something like, you know, and we don't pay teachers enough. Again, I would have like bristled at this like back when I was in education, simply because like the problem never seemed to me like not enough money. It seemed a lot more that it was stuff like, well, you're really infringing on all my time, which is why I stopped, you know, being involved, because it's like, you know, I want to write, I want to do this, and I can't do anything as a teacher. Right? Like I can't put in 60, 70, 80-hour weeks for that kind of salary. Right? So if we could somehow ease the workload and make it more rational, right, have fewer things to deal with, then, you know, like the pay wouldn't really matter so much. But he did say, you know, teachers are not being paid enough, which is true. At this point, you know, guess what? Whatever I might have said 10 years ago, at this point, given everything that teachers have to deal with now, we're talking about kids that emotionally are years behind development, physiologically. Intellectually, they're very far behind. Now you need more, right? You can't have cuts, right? So implicitly what he's saying is, you know, we need a greater budget for education, which, you know, I could get behind in this new world. But beyond that, like that was just like one straight comment that he made, right? In this far broader attack on either like American entitlements or entitlement as a concept, right? This pushing this idea of, you know, like getting what you don't deserve. You don't deserve any kind of redistributed wealth, right? So those were some of my observations watching Dr. Phil, watching Joe Rogan. You know, at a certain point, like nobody's going to change, right? They're whatever they were doing years and years ago, they're still going to be up to the same tricks. Maybe somebody, you know, bashes them over the head with the idea that, oh, you should be more careful about platforming right-wingers. You should be more careful about how you don't push back against XYZ. And they make some minor adjustments, but I mean, look, has anything really happened since Joe Rogan like started making some of those like public apologies a year or two ago, whenever it was? Nothing's really going to change. Like if, and that's the thing, right? This is exactly why status quo thinking is so, why it's so attractive, right, to the people making the arguments, right? They, nobody wants to change, period. But especially if you're comfortable with the way things are, if you like how things have turned out for you, right? Then you play with that kind of tinker toy, right? Meritocracy, that's a tinker toy. Right? I deserve what I have. Me personally, I feel like I work hard, but I've never once thought in my life that I deserve what I have. Right? Not when I was young. Not now, as I slide into middle age, would I ever say that I deserve innately what I have? I mean, like, what does that like? What does that even mean? What does that even mean, right? Deserve what exactly? Like, yes, there are things that I put effort into, right? Most people aren't going to sit around, writing a novel without any kind of like thought of like, is it going to sell? Like just like not caring, just like doing it for the sake of doing. But there's a certain set of circumstances in America, right? Meaning like I'm not in Russia anymore. I'm not in Belarus. I am in America. But that allows me to do that. It affords me the leisure to say things like, I'm going to give time and attention to this thing that I have in my own head, which is also its own kind of little tinker toy, right? Its own thing in my head that essentially says, oh, look, you could put time to it. You could put attention to it. It doesn't matter how it turns out in this kind of like, dirty sense of money, right? Dirty sense of like success. But for me to say that I somehow deserve it, right? That it's based all on merit. How many people are out there that could be my position, might be even working hard if they were in my position, right? Maybe they wouldn't have taken like a several year break from writing as I had. Maybe like that would be the only that they don't care. Maybe that, right, in poverty and like some, I don't know, in the Congo or whatever. Maybe if they hit upon that dream of leisure, they would have worked even harder. Or just think about the people that are just generically working hard labor, right? 12-hour, 16-hour days. In places like, I remember seeing this one documentary, right, about this, about South American migrants, and they were like, I have to work 12-hour days, sometimes 16-hour days, and I have to, at the end of the week, make a decision, food or medicine, right? Doesn't that person deserve so much more in the kind of like, just kind of most basic sense of like just deserts, right? Doesn't that person deserve much more than whatever, like, because whatever that you're going through, whatever existential angst or whatever problems that you might have, they would pale in comparison to chronically having to make this kind of decision, despite the fact that, you are the one out there, right, essentially feeding the global north. You are the one out there ensuring that the rest of the world is able to live in comfort, right? Because that's the kind of system that we're under. You have a huge population, the majority of people that are sort of greasing your own wheels. They're greasing that cart, right, of meritocracy. They're greasing those little train carts, and they're greasing it with their own, let's call them own little essential oils, right? They're making sure that all of that goes smoothly. So again, like what exactly have you deserved? How much of it is just luck? And I wish this was much more the discussion, right? That this idea of certain things are the way that they are. Let us adjust the role of luck, right? Because ultimately, like if you are a true conservative, right, one of your primary concerns ought to be this idea that there's so many unequal consequences for equal behaviors. And there are unequal consequences for equal behaviors for one reason only, which is luck, right? You want to minimize the role of luck in any kind of human endeavor, right? That needs to be the number one thing if you are a conservative. And that feeds into so many things. That feeds into like politics, right? That feeds into just kind of like more generic sort of striving. That feeds into like far more specific things that you might want to do, right? Such as the arts. But people are very uncomfortable discussing that, especially if they have any kind of status in the world. Because once you start discussing that, it sort of calls into question what you have done, right? Which is why, like, why am I in the arts, right? It's simply to, at least partly, right? It's partly to adjust for that reality, right? If I feel lucky, I need to be able to do something, right? To give something back. I need to make do with what I have with what's possible. Right, back to this idea of optionality, right? The idea that you have options in life. That's a total myth, right? There's no such thing as options in the world. If you are, for instance, great at something, or you can be great at something, or you could just simply be good at something, or you could be okay at one thing and then bad at everything else, you do have a kind of obligation to do that entire thing, right? To go in that direction, even if you don't like it, even if you don't want to, because the alternative is you spend your life doing something that is of less net benefit to the world, but maximum net benefit for you, right? And I know that there's this myth about, a net benefit for you is essentially and necessarily a net benefit for the rest of the world. But in reality, right, we're not in some sort of libertarian fantasy, right? We're in the real world. The real world doesn't work like that. And I wish when Dr. Phil would say shit like, let's discuss the real world, right? We're in the real world. Things don't work this way. I wish he would apply that in the other direction, right? Anyway, you know what it is, automachination.com, patreon.com/automachination. I'll be putting up some videos soon, this Sunday actually, of me doing some translations of Russian poetry and a bunch of other stuff for patrons as well as for the public. So thank you for watching.